Can you hear me properly?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you.
Okay, okay, that's good.
Let me just get it live on Facebook in a moment. And we are live as well. Good afternoon, morning, evening to everybody watching this webinar series. Thank you for tuning into yet another episode. Today we have with us Comrade Buyile Matiwane, is a South African youth activist, and he also serves as the Deputy President of South African Student Congress. Good afternoon, Comrade Buyile. How are you?
Good afternoon, man. Good afternoon, leadership, and all the viewers out there.
Great. Just to give an intro, we are Africa for Palestine, a human rights solidarity organization based in Africa. Our modus operandi is to spread awareness on the Palestinian cause across the African continent and to try to stop the infiltration of Israel into the continent as well. We work with many other organizations that identify with our cause, trade union movements, political organizations, church movements, different religions, and broader civil society, and indeed students' organizations as well. That's the work we do primarily. And today we're joined by an official of the South African Student Congress, which we've worked with in the past and we still work with closely on campus-based work, student advocacy on the issue of Palestine, and a range of other campaigns that we work on. Before we get into it, just introduce yourself, tell us who you are, the work you do at SASCO, and people who don't know you to have an understanding of where you come from.
Yeah. No, look, my name is Buyile Matiwane, as you've mentioned, and I'm the Deputy President of the South African Student Congress. And we believe the South African Student Congress to be the oldest student movement in Africa, and arguably the largest student movement in Africa. My responsibility as the Deputy President really is to coordinate our work around policy and research. So on all our research initiatives, I take the lead, and all policy-related matters are within my purview and the discipline, the general discipline of the organization. So, and then as an extension of all of that as well, I deal with international work on behalf of the organization. So we focus a lot on all our solidarity campaigns will be under my office. But basically, I led in the Western Cape from Cape Town. I was the provincial chair of South African Student Congress there for 3 terms. And then I was elected as the deputy president nationally for the organization. I'm a rural boy from a small town called Engcobo in the Eastern Cape. And that's basically who I am and what I do in the organization.
Thanks for that, Comrade. I like the added detail that I'm a rural boy. Comrade, those who are not familiar with SASCO, during this webinar series, I'm sure they'll be quite familiar with it after we're done. I think this is a student movement that has a lot of history in South Africa and in the African continent, particularly. So in your clauses in the Constitution, they say that you say that SASCO members are members of the community before they're students. So my understanding is that you organize in the campus sector. So when I become a student in university or a higher learning institution, I get to be a member of that. And you guys say that the understanding is that our members are members of the community before they are students. Of course, SASCO also has an ideological covenant worldview of a Marxist type of ideological perspective. Can you just walk us through the implications of those two?
I think, firstly, I think it flows logically that students are members of communities before they are students. And one thing that we have come to understand is that students are transient as a class. So they're in institutions for a period of time, in the process of developing an independent class structure. So they're transient. They're from a community. They're in an institution, but they're going to go back to the community, and that's the nature of students across the world, not just in our country. But we believe, and we still believe as an organization, that it would be a travesty not to confine our activism to just the campuses, because the implication of the sector and the nature of higher education sector is that what happens in the sector extends far beyond just the campuses. We shape the character of the economy, we shape the character and the structure of societies back home and communities. And naturally, by extension of our responsibility as a student movement, we have to have a more broader understanding of the responsibility of students beyond just classrooms and campuses. So I think it flows logically for us, because as transient beings in the organization, who are going to occupy a certain class character within our society later on, and are going to either be progressive or regressive, either going to be reactionary or whatever the character of that student post the higher education sector. That influences in a very real way the character of our country, the character of our economy, the character of our society. So we must have an interest in the nature and character of our societies, of our communities, not just because students come from those communities, but because students, by their very nature, are going to go back to those communities. So I think it's a logical extension of our responsibility that we would have an adverse interest in communities and how we build and how we create progressive social actors in those communities, because our responsibility in the higher education space is to create responsible social actors that are going to go back to communities and hopefully create progressive communities later on in life. And I think that's our responsibility. I think the higher education space has been very confined around its enunciation around progressive thought, progressive dialogue, and creating progressive actors in our society. So that's the space that we occupy as a student organization, that we have a responsibility, and it's a natural extension of our historical responsibilities to have an interest in our communities.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that. I think for viewers who are also not familiar, is that SASCO was formed from another organization called SASCO, which was led by Steve Biko, who at the time, Steve Biko took his activism away from campus, back into the communities. So they would have clinics and so on in the communities. Was a medical student.
Yeah, I think I think naturally, I think that's something historically, SASO, which is also part of the history of SASCO, they had what they call the Black People's Convention. The older viewers might know the Black People's Convention, and they believed that community work and by extension conscientizing our communities about the lived realities, not just in those communities, but in broader society, was an important component in shaping consciousness and in shaping progressive communities and social actors in our society. So SASO, which was a student movement, had an adverse interest in creating the Black People's Convention, which was to work in communities in our society, not just to assist, but to build consciousness, but to actively build consciousness, not passively, not just through theory, but to practically work in our communities, change the living conditions of our communities as a means to practically conscientize our people about the lived realities in those communities and beyond those communities. So that's part of our history, and that's part of where we get our pillar, which is community work, which is one of our pillars in SASCO. But obviously, the more theoretical background is the one that I gave earlier, that we do believe as a natural and logical extension of our responsibility. Historically, we have an obligation as a student movement to really look at our communities and shape progressive communities, but also those communities don't exist outside the social actors. So those students that go back to those communities must be those agents that are going to shape progressive communities that understand wholly what is the condition of not just those communities, but of our society, and what is the progressive outlook of a society that understands itself and that's growing into itself in relation to the issues that it's confronted with. So that's a bit of a history that we share in relation to community work and community engagement as an organization.
Speaking of pillars of your organization, one of the pillars that is of interest, particularly for this discussion, is internationalism. I think you have 5, if not 6 pillars. Internationalism is part of those pillars. Would you just walk us through what does that mean in relation to your organization?
I think it ties in quite well with the previous pillar we just spoke about, which was community work. I think when you understand that the interconnectedness and the interconnected nature of society, and by extension, our own humanity is not complete without the humanity of others. So international work is about understanding not just the geopolitical situation of our country and those around us, but understanding the global balance of forces and how we need to be active agents in changing internationally or globally, in changing the character and the nature of progressive thinking outside not just our country, but because our global economy is so interlinked and interconnected, and our people are so interlinked and interconnected, we need to have an adverse interest in doing international solidarity campaigns to progressively conscientize the international community in line with what we perceive to be at any point in time progressive or regressive global balance of forces, to shape the thinking around solidarity, around our common humanity as a people. So I think it's about understanding and much in line with our view on community work as an extension of our responsibility to create proactive and progressive agents in society. It's a natural extension of our understanding of how interconnected our humanity is. We can't wholly be human as a country or wholly express ourselves as society if we accept any inference or any undermining of humanity anywhere else in the world, you know. So it mustn't just be stifled in a community. We must extend our activism beyond just our communities, but it starts with the community. But by natural extension of the progressive nature of our struggle, we must have an interest in the common humanity and the interconnectedness of our society internationally, you know. So that is why we have an interest in the plight of the people of Palestine. We have an interest in what is happening in Swaziland, in Cuba, what is happening in all parts of the world. In Venezuela, we had an interest there. We have an interest in what's happening in all parts of the globe, because we believe that we share a common humanity as a people. And as an organization, we must extend not just our footprint, but we must extend our social actors and our progressive change agents that should be molded within the organization to have an adverse interest in shaping the global community and in really influencing the global balance of forces to becoming much more progressive and representative of our common humanity as a people. And our aim must be to create a platform for shared prosperity in our world, you know. So I think currently there's inordinate amounts of inequality, of suffering, of poverty, of injustice, of really vile injustices that undermine our collective humanity as society. And that is why SASCO must, and has a responsibility and an obligation to extend beyond just South Africa, but look at how our common humanity can be extended to other parts of the world. And I think that's where we get our drive and our zeal for internationalism?
It's very interesting that you point that out. Even in our historical context, you find that in the late 60s, in the early 70s, and also in the 1976 uprising held in this regard, you had campuses across the world where advocacy work for anti-apartheid movement was so strong, but then you'd have the government's right wing, so Margaret Thatcher in the UK, you'd have Ronald Reagan in the UK, in the US, but those particular campuses, student organizations, student movements on those campuses were strongly for the anti-apartheid movement. They would invite anti-apartheid activists to come on campuses and talk. This extends, of course, in Nigeria as well. We know this in Tunisia. In many parts of the world, campuses were very fertile ground for this kind of internationalism activism. Why do you think students are more flexible group in society to deal with internationalism and, as opposed to others?
Sorry, my connection is a bit unstable, so I didn't get the last part. But I think generally our position around the student movement playing its role in really strengthening progressively international solidarity has been a natural extension of our response. It's our responsibility, and that's the approach that we take generally as SASCO, that we occupy a very peculiar position in society, which is having the intelligentsia of society in our sector that has the responsibility not just to analyze, but to change society progressively. So with that comes the responsibility, not just to analyze society passively, but with that understanding and that realization of the nature of our society and the regressive nature at times of society. Our impetus as a student movement is far more emboldened to change that society because we're far more aware of that society. So consciousness is not something that you just falls from the sky, you know. You learn it through lived experience, through broadening your understanding and your knowledge, and higher institutions of higher learning generally are centers where you can get that experience, and that is why you are far more critical in an institution, or you should be far more critical, far more analytical, far more engaged, far more aware of what's happening in society, and with that comes the impetus to change society. So I think for us, it was logical that a lot of change agents would and should be stemming from the higher education sector, because the youth naturally who are going to occupy the future of this country must have a concerted interest in the future of this country. So we can't stand idly by as the youth and as students specifically when gross injustice is at our doorstep. And with our position in society, we then occupy more greatly the responsibility to change that, because we're far more aware, we're far more and I say this cautiously, we should be more enlightened as a sector. And with that comes a responsibility to be the proactive change agents of that society. So I think for historically, it's always been a natural process of any student organization to be moved by injustice, because we are far more aware of the far-reaching implications to our own humanity that the persistence of that injustice poses. And I think because of that, naturally students from across the world would have been centers, and the youth and students particularly have always been catalysts to change. You know, it's never come from the old and frail and the complacent. It's always come from those that have the energy, have the foresight, because they must inherit this world. You know, that's the reality, is that we as the youth and students in particular, we must inherit this world, and we must shape the character of the world that we must inherit. So we must have a concerted interest in humanity, in the nature and the progressive nature of that society. So when you are in an institution, it gives you requisite insight around your responsibility to do that. You don't have the comfort of we don't have the comfort of being complacent, you know. And I think that's how I can put it. As a student, you don't have the comfort of being complacent, and that is why a lot of these anti-apartheid, humanitarian, solidarity movements have always stemmed by and large from student movements or from students themselves in institutions, because we should be far more aware, we should be far more engaged, we should be far more interested progressively in the future of our countries.
Yes, I think that encapsulates most of what we see on campus. Not only on internationalism, on a range of issues in society, sexual abuse and decolonization, and so on. Our campus has been a site of struggle. Now, you've taken a number of positions unpopular with, let's say, the West. You've taken a historical position in Cuba. You've taken a radical position as well on Swaziland. You've mentioned Venezuela. And that, of course, has a leftist outlook as the organization, I understand, is a leftist Marxist type of an organization. Just explain that little bit to us.
I think for us, and I think you mentioned it in that we view institutions as a site of struggle, and institutions being a site of struggle means they've got the prerogative to shape the thinking and to be analytical around what we believe to be certain elements that are not progressive in outlook around injustice, the polarization of our people, gross human rights violations, the persistence of inequality, of poverty, and other issues we're confronted with, and because of that, because we've got an outlook to that seeks to create a more progressive outlook of our society, that understands our common humanity, the equality before the law, that we should all actively endeavor to create an environment that places not just our common humanity, but our ability to wholly self-actualize as a people. And that's informed our various positions on whether it be Swaziland, where we believe that there's been some injustice around, there's been a lot of injustice and inequality, and just an environment that isn't pro the advancement of human rights and human liberties that we believe to be progressive. Or whether it's Cuba, and we understand the internationalist politics that surround the sanctions and a lot of the issues in Cuba, whether it was Tunisia you mentioned earlier, or whether it was Venezuela. And we actually went to Venezuela when a lot of the conflict was the conflict and unrest was happening in Venezuela, and that informed our progressive positions around understanding how the Bretton Woods establishments institutions have basically squared the international community and shaped what we don't believe to be a progressive global community or international outlook currently. So we work to change that, because we believe that the current rate of inequality, of poverty, of injustice is not one that besets a future that enables the progressive realization of our humanity as a people. So because of that, we have an adverse interest to align ourselves, and we've aligned ourselves as where we are, to some extent, we believe in Marx-Leninist tools of analysis, and we have a left-leaning posture as an organization, because we believe that we must all must all work towards advancing our common humanity. And anything that undermines that, whether it's human rights, whether it's internationalist politics, whatever it may be, we as an organization must take a position, and we've taken a position that we believe advances the progressive realization, not just of human rights, but of creation of a progressive society that is more equal, more just, more equitable, and creates conditions to realize or to fully realize our full potential and common prosperity in our world. So that's been our position, we didn't take things just at face value. And in Swaziland, we'd gone to Swaziland before taking our position. We've gone to Cuba. We've seen the condition in Cuba before taking our position. So it was very practical for us to take the positions that we've taken. And we don't take those positions lightly, you know. But we believe that it's always been an advancement of our common humanity as a people, an advancement for more human rights, more equality, more justice, because those are principles that we stand by, you know, democracy, human rights, and equality, the alleviation of poverty, and all of those principles are principles that we stand by as an organization. Historically, we've always stood by them.
Thanks for that holistic explanation. So SASCO was one of the first organizations in the world, student organizations in the world, to have an academic boycott of Israel. For viewers who don't understand the term, is when an organization or an entity or institution decides to not have any ties with Israeli institutions for their complicity with human rights violations in Palestine. SASCO was one of the very first organizations in the world to take this position in the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. What can other student organizations learn from this? Taking this bold step, a very unpopular step, unfashionable, I can even say.
I think I got the gist of the question, though my connection is not that good. But I think and in relation to the academic boycott, specifically with Israel, we had long understood the nature of institutions of higher learning, not just in Israel, but even in our country, and the role they play in propagating certain thoughts and certain attitudes that we believe were in the instance of Israel were regressive, and were propagating a narrative that wasn't in tune and in line with the lived reality of the people of Palestine. And I think institutions were used we've defined them as a site of struggle before, and they were used and are being used, let's be honest, are still being used to propagate perceptions that are not in tune and in line with the lived reality of the people on the ground in Palestine. So if they're going to be used as a tool for propaganda, and they're going to be used as a tool to perpetuate inequality and repression, and they were used in that nature even in this country, you know, and that is why many institutions around the world also advanced a boycott and disinvestment and sanctions campaign, but boycott, and there was a boycott around certain elements of our institutions as well during the anti-apartheid struggle, because they were being used to propagate certain narratives that weren't in line with the lived reality of our people in South Africa and yesteryear. So it's just the same, and we look at that just the same in Israel, where institutions there, and whether it be academic staff that propagate certain narratives and are using their influence and the platforms that they're being given to propagate untruths and propaganda, to sustain a repressive, oppressive regime. We take exception to that, and that's what informs our position around the academic boycott, because institutions, though we believe in academic freedom, but we believe academic freedom mustn't be at the expense of our civil liberties as a people, and academic freedom can't be used as a cover, as a smokescreen to propagate and to sustain the oppression and the repression of people anywhere in the world. And that's what informed our stance around an academic boycott of Israel, you know. And and I think in one of your documents, in one of the documents I've read, it's not a wholesale boycott of everything, you know, of even individuals, but we're not having an issue of individuals. We're having a systemic issue with the nature of some institutions and academy in Israel and how it's being used. So I don't want to individualize this. It's not about individuals, but it's about academy and how academy is being used in Israel to create a platform to further alienate, isolate, and propagate injustice and against the people of Palestine. So, and that is our position, you know. And so far as we believe that Israeli institutions are still a canvas to isolate economically, socially, politically the people of Palestine, we will sustain our academic boycott against Israel and the Academy of Israel. And I think that's what informs our position and what informed our position very early on around the academic boycott of Israel.
I think it's very interesting you bring about that it's not about individuals per se, but institutions that enable the oppression of Palestinians, complicit and a catalyst as well. We know in our case in South Africa that universities like the University of Pretoria, there were bioweapon studies. So the university was being used to develop weapons, biological weapons against the indigenous African people. So it's not necessarily individuals that agree with you fundamentally. It's institutions that are being used in the name of academic freedom, but to perpetuate oppression and gross human rights violation in Palestine. It's not an anti-Semitic issue. It's not an issue against one person, but it's an issue against a system, as you said. But to that effect, what was very, I think, interesting about your organization is you did not only take the resolution, you made it into practice. In 2012, the University of Johannesburg was the first university in the country that cut academic ties with Israel, followed by the University of Technology, one of the biggest as well in the country. Your student representative councils across the 23 universities also have taken that resolution in the past. What would you say makes this very much possible in South Africa? But it's very difficult in other countries by when other people come to South Africa, like, oh, you've done that. Oh, that's so difficult. What has made it possible for you in this country to achieve these goals?
I think it's an understanding of our own history that necessitated and created conditions for us to really be able to conscientize our students. And I think, let me make this point, in fact, just briefly, that we are very progressive in relation to the positions taken by and large, propagated by our student leadership. But our institutions and management in our institutions hasn't been as forthcoming, in a lot of our other institutions. So student leadership has taken the bait and has led the frontal, but we are still lacking in relation to a progressive response from university managers, university heads, and that's something that we must be very wary of. That we have progressive, or we seem to have progressive student leaders, but the managers in those institutions don't seem to have a progressive outlook as yet, and that might be also motivated by a lot of other things, money and other things. But I don't want to venture into that for now. But I just to go back to the question, that I think it's because of our common history, not just common history, but the fact that we as a country have understood how institutions can have an exclusive nature and can be canvases of the exclusion and perpetuation of inequality. And that was the case in our country, but have perpetuated and are still perpetuating inequality in Israel. So that's what necessitated. It's our understanding of our own history that created conditions for us to be able to take that position here, and to take such a stance against Israel, which we believe to be an academy in Israel. We believe to be not progressive, but an extension of the systemic exclusion and perpetuation of gross human rights violations against the people of Palestine. So we understood that for what it was, and we must still do a lot of work to lobby and to really get our institutions and institutional management to really take a more firmer position, and to some extent, if I were to venture, even our government, in relation to academy and academic boycott and other solidarity campaigns that we're embarking on in the sector, to take a more firmer position around some of those campaigns that we have long been engaged in as a student movement. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that. But students, because of the nature and understanding the nature of education and having a history look, our history stems from 1924 from the establishment of NUSAS to SASCO, to ASASO, to SANSCO, to SASCO, what we now is SASCO. I mean, that history for us and the historical understanding of the sector is what created the conditions for us to be able to influence not just our membership alone, but to influence our SRCs to take a position that we believe to be progressive. And we still need to do that with our university managers. And we need to influence the process of having progressive university managers quite more. We need to be far more engaged in influencing that process. I think it's not something that we've been particularly good at in influencing the character of the type of vice chancellors we must have in our institutions, the type of councils that we must have in our institutions. We haven't really exhausted our energies in really shaping a progressive outlook in our university managers and councils. But to answer the long and short of your question is that the student movement and its history and its understanding of the history of our sector is what created conditions for us to be able to influence our membership and students broadly, but also by extension SRCs to take progressive stance against what we believe to be a common shared history. You know, we also had that history in our country where institutions were very exclusive, were very alienating, were very repressive, and because we understood that necessitated our action and our bold action against that.
Another interesting point I wanted to raise with you, Comrade Deputy President, is how your organization and other solidarity movements in South Africa have been able to raise awareness in South Africa, especially on campuses. I mean, if you look in the North, University of Venda to University of Limpopo, you go to University of the Free State in Kwakwa, you go to University of Cape Town in the Western Cape, in Durban, University of Technology, Mangosuthu, University of Technology, you go to Wits University, University of Pretoria. All these campuses manage once a year to run Israeli apartheid campaigns. And this is in most campuses of the country. What lessons can others, student organizations across the continent, across the globe, learn from your organization in executing this? And I might say very difficult task, of course, but to do it so consistently and so effectively.
I think it starts with building structures, you know. So the benefit for us is that we have over time, it wasn't an overnight thing, but we've established structures, you know, and structures that we can call upon, structures that are active, and those structures are what we use as a vehicle to influence our campuses. So the structure is important, and the politics. I always say to comrades, politics and the structure and the branch, you know, is the horse, and SRCs and governance and all the bureaucracy is the cart, and you must never put the cart before the horse. So focus on developing political consciousness and political structures, you know, and once you do that, and once you've got a grounding, you know, you are better enabled to influence the politics and the character of those campuses. So I think we are fortunate enough to have a long history, and over time and over a long time, you know, NUSAS was established in 1924, and it merged with SASCO in 1991 to establish SASCO. So it's been a period, arguably, we have a shared history of 95 years now. But we've invested in creating the capacity of our structures, regularly engaging our structures, always keep the topics flowing, you know, never have a lull in an organization, you know. So keep people talking, keep people engaging, you know, And it's not a perfect science. You're not gonna have the most progressive outlook from the onset. But the more you keep refining your positions, and we're still learning as an organization in SASCO, we're refining our positions time and again. We're continually engaging. We have a relation with Africa for Palestine that we'll continually refine our thinking around solidarity work and other work that we must be doing as a movement. So it's about having those linkages and working on those linkages, working on those and working on your own understanding and capacity to influence those campuses. And I think the one ingredient is consistency. Even if there are 2 people, even if there are 5, even if there are 10, do it. But do it consistently. And I think that's a vital ingredient at creating progressive structures on our campuses. So it was through consistency. We've always said, even before Fees Must Fall, we're the only organization year in, year out that had a free education march. Whether or not it was well attended or it wasn't well attended is another story. But for years, year in, year out, before we had the Fees Must Fall uprising, we were consistently having a free education march, and we're the only organization that was doing that. And I think it would be remiss to think that didn't have an impact in shaping consciousness on our campuses and in any way shaping our understanding and shaping the activism on those campuses. So it's about consistency. It's about building the body politic, and building consciousnness. And it's incremental. The nature of it is incremental. We've been existing for 95 years now. If you track our shared history from the establishment of NUSAS in 1924, so that's no easy feat, to exist for so long. And because of that, we have a presence in a lot of the TVET colleges. We have a presence in a lot of the universities across the country. We just finished, I think we just got back last week. We had deployment of our NECs across all provinces and covering as many institutions as they could. So we've covered most institutions across the country. And just that goes a long way in establishing our structures, checking if our structures are active, are vibrant. And when we need to do campaigns, we have active participants and active agents to carry out the work that needs to be done on the ground. So it's about consistency, and there's no other formula.
I volunteered to be a witness that SASCO marched every year. I was part of SASCO in my campus days, and every year we would go to Pretoria, Francis Bad. I don't know if the offices are still there, and then we would march for free education. The slogan back then was free education or death, or something radical like that. So I can attest to the consistency of the movement. Wrapping it up, Comrade Buyile, globally, there's been a resurgence of youth-led movements. And we were having this type of webinar yesterday about the youth and how the youth have reimagined protest, they've reimagined social justice through, even in South Africa, the Roads Must Fall campaign, the Fees Must Fall campaign, the Me Too movement on sexual abuse, the now Black Lives Matter, social media and so on, and the Yellow Vest in France, the uprisings in Chile against the right-wing government. Young people are taking a center stage, and young people are saying, no, if this is what you were doing before, this is how we should be done. And the youth are taking a center stage in it. And I think even in the period in South Africa, the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movement became more than free education, became a decolonization type of conversation. Is that, okay, the country is not moving in the right direction to transform, not only in education, in many other sectors as well. So this is a trend globally of young people reimagining, changing, reshaping how society revolves, how society transforms. Do you think we live in an age where young people are dictating the future of where the world is going?
I don't think young people are necessarily dictating the future as yet. But as the contradictions ripen and the contradictions sharpen, I think there will come a time where we can't be ignored as young people in taking decisions that shape the world and the character of not just social issues, but of economic issues, the global economy, and how it's structured. And the role of youth is because it's natural, the current order and the current progression of society currently is untenable. Growing inequality, growing poverty, the alienation of people, mass youth unemployment just in this country, not just in this country, but in many other countries, So young people are becoming more disenfranchised, and as they become more disenfranchised, the contradictions sharpen, and as they sharpen, we need to become more inventive, more innovative, more aggressive at really shaping the future, a future that must be more encompassing of our common humanity. So the agency for that is far more emboldened as the contradictions become sharpened. And that's what we have seen across the world, is that the more we ignore youth and I was saying to comrades just the other day, is that we never get violent protests when people are, when they're employed and when inequality is being addressed, and you never get violent or you never get robust forms of protest when their needs are being catered for, and specifically the youth. But when there are mass retrenchments and when there's poverty, when there's when there's all these exclusions of the youth, which is the future of this country, is when we get all these forms of protest emerging. And it's a natural, and I believe, and we believe it to be a natural, it's a natural response to a global economy that is exclusive, a global economy that is repressive to some extent. And that is when you get the impetus for young people to stand up and to take center stage around the vile oppressions and inequalities that persist, whether it be racism, whether it be inequality, poverty, or any other vile undermining of our humanity as a people. And I think we need to also strengthen our activism in this country. When you have 30% of young people that voted in the last election, it's a sign of a youth that is disenfranchised and disenchanted with the current status quo. When you have growing levels of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment and graduate unemployment increasing on a daily basis, those give you the recipes for a youth that must engage to some extent. If we don't accommodate progressive thinking and progressive means to address those issues, the only way that young people are going to be engaging is through protest, through getting on the streets and voicing their frustrations and the very real frustrations that they're confronted with, because you have not secured a place for them in the future of this country. And that's the reality. So the impetus for us as society and as humanity to really secure the place of the youth in this country is far more emboldened. And I think because of this COVID-19 pandemic and the economic ramifications that it's going to come with, we need to prioritize how we locate and where we locate young people in decision-making, in the economy of this country, in relation to the growing frustrations and the growing frustrations that will enable young people and will force young people to become quite more robust in venting their frustrations. So I think what's happening across the world is endemic of a global economy that needs to change. That needs to prioritize the views and the needs and the aspirations of its future, and that future is young people. Young people will inherit this world. And that's not me being anything but logical. Naturally, the young will inherit the earth, and I think the powers that be need to realize that before it's too late. And even in this country, we've got mass retrenchments happening currently. Mass retrenchments in your EdCon group and your many other many other corporates are retrenching workers and young people, to be specific. And it's a recipe for disaster, for lack of a better word. It's a recipe for disaster if we don't prioritize the needs, the aspirations, and the yearning for common humanity of young people in this country. We're gonna have protest action that is fueled by a sharpening of those contradictions. Roads must fall, by the way. I've always said this. I think Roads Must Fall was a product of sharpened contradictions. When I've always said that the statue of Rhodes at UCT has always been there. Why did it become an issue? Why did it become an issue when it became an issue? And isn't it because the character of the Black that was going to UCT at the time started to change? Their background was different, because there was a discussion early on about entrance requirements at UCT and them having to change to necessitate a different type of Black entering UCT. And when that Black came into UCT, those contradictions sharpened. And when they sharpened, the necessity and the outrage around what we believe to be a history that didn't represent our common humanity, that outrage enveloped into what we now know as Roads Must Fall, and later on to Fees Must Fall. So when the contradictions sharpen, naturally, the impetus for the youth and for society to shape the future, not just of this country, but of the world, will become far more emboldened. And when that happens, we are having these are all symptoms of a global economy that isn't all encompassing. And that's what we believe, that all these protests and youth-led protests are symptoms of an economy that doesn't appreciate its youth, that doesn't appreciate its future, And if we continue not appreciating it, we are creating a melting pot of for society that is going to, in the future, turn to very robust, and I like to call them robust means of protest and innovative means of protest. So I think I don't think we are as yet shaping the world, because the powers that be are still, it's still your World Banks, your IMFs, the economic bullish behavior of your Americas and all of that, and we influencing certain elements of that, but I don't think we're yet in the driving seat, But if this continues, if inequality continues, and if all of these repressive, or if the repressive nature of the system continues unabated, in future, I think very well young people, and it might not be me and you, as young as we are, that are going to be in the forefront of that barrage of change agents that will sort to aggressively change society. And we've seen it historically. It's happened before, there have been many revolutions in our history that indicate that when the contradictions sharpen is when you're going to find that society has no other means to shape a future that is all-encompassing beyond becoming robust, becoming innovative, becoming to some extent destructive. Because if society doesn't represent currently the aspirations of our people, the natural inclination of our people is to become destructive, So, and that's why there's a need and an impetus for us as a people to start prioritizing young people, to start understanding what is the need for the future, what is the shape of a progressive future for our young people that must inherit this world. And when we do that, we can start to navigate having a world that understands the necessity for its youth and the necessity for change and for progressive conscientization of young people and society in general.
Thank you so much, Comrade Buyile. That was a mouthful. And I certainly hope for the many of our comrades globally, those who organize in campuses in the UK, in the US, Jewish Voices for Peace, those who organize in campuses in Tunisia, Algeria, Nigeria, and other parts of the continent on this particular issue of internationalization. and internationalism, they really get lessons from SASCO. You've been doing great work, Comrade, and keep up the good work. We see it, and certainly Palestinians see it as well, and the world sees that well. Continue the good work, and thank you so much for being with us today.
No, I think we must sincerely thank you as a student movement for the opportunity to work with you more than anything, and to share our views. And it's not a perfect science. We might not always be right, but we know we'll know that we are wrong when we are wrong through engagement like this one. So I think this is also beneficial for us as much as it's beneficial for anyone that's viewing this, that we are having a reflective matrix to understand ourselves and our activism. So I think for us, it's also to open up the discussion, you know, and I'm hoping we'll get feedback from those that are watching, and also suggestions around how do we strengthen our solidarity work with, and also in partnership with Africa for Palestine. How do we move forward in creating a more prosperous, more encompassing society, and do solidarity work that is far-reaching, meaningful, and really changes the lives of our people.
Thank you. Definitely we'll be getting those reviews, and this will be the first of many other interactions. Hopefully we'll have more physical ones when the virus subsides, and I will have more content. Certainly. Goodbye.
Oh, thanks a lot, my brother. Sure.